Iommi didn't make a big speech about it. That's probably what makes the whole thing more interesting. He had a new album coming, his first full solo record in more than 20 years. There were plenty of names he could have called, people who would have answered immediately, I imagine. Guitarists who had grown up copying him. Musicians who would probably have crossed an ocean just to play 8 bars on a Iommi record. But when the question came up about a special guest, there was Brian May. And then, strangely enough, there was nobody else. Not nobody else playing on the album, of course. Tony had built a proper band around the songs. Jörn Lande singing, Becky Baldwin on bass, Carl Brazil behind the drums. But in terms of the famous outside name, the unexpected visitor, the person who could step into Tony's world without making the whole thing feel like some celebrity parade, Brian was the one. That sounds simple when you say it quickly. It isn't, because Tony Iommi has known almost everyone. Think about that for a second. This is a man who came out of Birmingham before heavy metal even had a proper name. He watched an entire genre form around Black Sabbath. He knew Ozzy when Ozzy was still Ozzy from Aston, not a global symbol. He crossed paths with Jimmy Page, Eddie Van Halen, Ronnie James Dio, countless musicians who became legends themselves. So why Brian? Tony has actually been answering that question in pieces for years, without really announcing that he was doing it. He once described Brian as one of his rock gods, not because Brian was the loudest player in the room, not because Queen sounded anything like Sabbath. It was the opposite. Really. Brian sounded like Brian. Tony remembered hearing Queen's early records and immediately recognizing something different in the guitar tone, the phrasing, the way those notes seemed to arrive with their own personality. Years later, when he spoke about Brian publicly, you could still hear that admiration underneath the friendship. And friendship is the word that keeps coming back. Not industry friend. Not we see each other at awards shows. Friend. They met in the early 1970s when their bands were working in nearby studios. Tony later recalled that Brian was in one studio, he was in another, and somehow they simply clicked. Decades later, he would describe them as best friends. You know how unusual that is in rock music? 2 guitarists from enormous bands, 2 men with unmistakable sounds, 2 careers surrounded by comparisons, ego, rankings, magazine covers asking who was better than whom, and yet that doesn't seem to be the language they use with each other. There's something almost old-fashioned about it. Respect without performance. Brian admires Tony's riffs. Tony admires Brian's sound. No need to win. Maybe that matters more now, especially after the last year Tony has lived through, because this new album did not arrive in some ordinary chapter of his life. Ozzy Osbourne had died in July 2025, only weeks after Black Sabbath's final performance together in Birmingham. Tony later spoke about how strange the absence felt, almost difficult to process because Ozzy's face and voice were still everywhere. And then Tony returned to his own music, quietly, older, carrying a lot more history than he once did. And somewhere inside one of the darkest songs on that record, he wanted another guitar. Not just any guitar, Brian's. That choice had been building for nearly 50 years. The strange part is, Brian nearly gave him even less than Tony wanted. Brian didn't arrive on From the Dark because Tony needed another famous name on the cover. That part matters. By the time Tony began talking publicly about the album in 2026, he had already made a decision about its character. He wanted it to feel like a band, not one of those records where every track becomes a guessing game. Who's the guest here? Who's playing there? The musicians around him were Jörn Lande, Becky Baldwin, and Carl Brazil, and Tony seemed comfortable keeping that core intact. Brian May became the exception, the only high-profile outside guest. And even Brian almost made himself smaller than Tony intended. Tony asked him to play on Deathwake, a dark, heavy piece that apparently felt right for Brian's voice on guitar. Brian came to Tony's home studio and recorded his part. Then Tony did something revealing. He asked if Brian wanted to play on something else. Brian said no, not because he disliked the material, quite the opposite. His response was essentially that Tony's solos were already good enough. He didn't need to add himself everywhere. That's a tiny exchange. But I keep coming back to it, because imagine the egos that could exist in that room. Tony Iommi, Brian May, 2 men whose guitar sounds can be identified before the singer even opens his mouth. 2 people who have spent more than half a century being called legends, pioneers, icons, All those enormous words. And Brian walks into his friend's studio, contributes what Tony needs, then apparently has no desire to turn the album into a Brian May showcase. There's something revealing in that restraint. Maybe Tony knew there would be. Their friendship had already survived long enough for both men to know exactly what the other was like when nobody was watching. Years earlier, Tony described what happened when Brian visited his house. There would be a guitar waiting. Brian was always playing, Tony said. He loved the instrument so much that even a social visit could somehow end with the two of them holding guitars. Tony once publicly called Brian one of his rock gods. That sounds almost strange coming from Iommi. Who does the man who helped invent heavy metal call a rock god? Brian May. But the admiration wasn't based on reputation alone. Tony had already seen something unusual decades earlier. In 1989, Brian played on Black Sabbath's When Death Calls, and there's a detail from those sessions that almost explains the whole relationship better than any compliment could. Brian wasn't using the familiar red special setup people associate with Queen. He played through Tony's equipment, yet Tony remembered that Brian still sounded like Brian. The same identity was there. Tony's conclusion was simple. The sound wasn't really hiding inside the equipment. It was in the player. Think about what that means coming from Tony Iommi. His own sound had been shaped by necessity. As a teenager working in a factory, Tony suffered the accident that severed the tips of 2 fingers on his right hand. He could have stopped playing. Instead, he fashioned homemade fingertip extensions, altered his approach, and eventually helped create a guitar language generations would imitate. Brian's story was completely different. He and his father built the Red Special themselves. Different lives, different hands, different bands. But both men understood something deeply personal about sound. You can buy the amplifier, you can buy the guitar, you cannot buy the person behind it. Maybe that is why this friendship has always seemed slightly different from the usual rock star friendship. They don't need to sound alike. They don't even come from the same musical temperament. Queen could be theatrical, layered, almost extravagant. Sabbath could make 4 notes feel like the walls were closing in. Yet Tony heard Brian and recognized identity. Brian heard Tony and recognized the same thing. And there's another detail that makes the relationship harder to dismiss as ordinary professional affection. In late 2025, Brian gave Tony an extraordinary gift, a specially built left-handed version of Brian's Red Special, customized for Iommi. It had taken roughly 2 years to create, and even incorporated measurements inspired by the neck of Tony's own famous Old Boy SG. That isn't the kind of gift you pick up before dinner. 2 years. A guitar built around another man's hands. I don't know. Maybe I'm reading too much into an instrument, but with guitarists like these, an instrument is rarely only an instrument. And months later, when Tony needed one outside voice on his new record, the man who had built that gift for him was standing in his studio. Brian played his solo. Tony asked for more. Brian refused gently. Your solos are good. Then he left Tony's music enough room to remain Tony's. Sometimes choosing someone isn't about what they add. Sometimes it's about knowing they won't take too much. There is another reason Tony's choice feels heavier now. Time has changed both men, not in some dramatic, cinematic way, more quietly than that. Tony survived cancer. Brian survived his own frightening health scares. They have both reached the age where a phone call from an old friend carries a different weight than it did in 1985. And then there was Ozzy. For Tony, losing him wasn't simply losing the singer from Black Sabbath. Their history was too tangled for that. They had fought, separated, reunited, irritated each other, laughed together, and somehow kept circling back for more than 50 years. After Ozzy was gone, Tony kept working. That's what musicians like him do. But you have to wonder whether the silence feels different now. Brian understands that kind of absence. He lived through Freddie Mercury's death and watched Queen become something none of them had planned for, a band carrying forward with one of its essential voices permanently missing. Maybe that shared experience matters more than either man says aloud. Because when Tony invited Brian onto Death Wake, he wasn't inviting someone who merely understood guitar. Brian understood survival. He understood what it meant to stand on a stage after the person beside you was gone. And Tony knew that. There is a photograph of the two men together that says more than most interviews do. No performance, no dramatic pose, just two older friends close enough to look comfortable. You see it differently when you know what both have lost. For decades, Rock magazines trained people to compare musicians. Who was heavier, faster, more influential? Tony and Brian seem almost past that now. Perhaps they were always past it. At this point, what would they even be competing for? Another ranking? Another cover? No. Tony had one place on the record that needed another voice, and he called someone who had been there long before either of them knew how much they would eventually have to say goodbye to. By 2026, the friendship between Tony Iommi and Brian May had become something almost unusual in rock music. Not because they were close, because they had stayed close. That is harder than it sounds. Bands fall apart. Friendships disappear. People who once spent every night together can go 20 years without speaking. Success changes people, illness changes people, grief changes people even more. Tony and Brian somehow kept finding their way back to the same room, sometimes literally. Tony has spoken about Brian visiting his home and eventually ending up with a guitar in his hands. No ceremony, no big plan. Just two men who had spent their lives making enormous sounds, sitting around and playing. I think that image matters, because when people hear names like Black Sabbath and Queen, they imagine stadiums, lights, thousands of people screaming, but friendship rarely survives because of those moments. It survives in quieter ones, a visit, a phone call, a guitar passed across a room. And by the time Brian appeared on From the Dark, Tony didn't need to discover whether they worked together. He already knew. They had shared music before. Brian had appeared on Black Sabbath's When Death Calls decades earlier. Tony had watched Brian create his own unmistakable sound, even through unfamiliar equipment. That stayed with him. Then came the years when both men were forced to confront their own mortality more directly. Tony's cancer diagnosis in the early 2010s changed the rhythm of his life. Brian later suffered serious health scares of his own, including a heart attack and, years later, a minor stroke that temporarily affected movement in his arm. For guitarists, hands are not just hands. You can imagine the fear, and maybe that is why the image of Brian recording again with Tony feels different now. Nobody in that room was 25 anymore. There was history sitting between them. Illness, people missing, Freddie, Ozzy, friends who never made it this far, and still there they were, playing. That may be the real reason Tony's choice feels so personal. Brian wasn't there because Tony needed someone impressive. Tony has nothing left to prove in that sense. Brian was there because after 50 years, Tony already knew what would happen when Brian touched the guitar. He would sound like himself. And perhaps, at this stage of life, that is exactly the kind of person you want beside you. Maybe that is the part of this story that becomes harder to ignore the longer you sit with it. Tony Iommi did not need Brian May. Not in the practical sense. He could have finished the record without him. He could have played every guitar part himself, kept the whole thing sealed inside his own sound, and nobody would have questioned it. Tony has spent more than half a century proving that a few notes from his hands can change the temperature of a room. So when Brian appears on From the Dark, it does not feel like necessity. It feels like choice. And those are very different things because at this stage of Tony's life, choices carry more weight than they used to. When you are young, everything feels open. There is always another album, another tour, another year, another chance to call somebody later. You can fall out with a friend and assume there will be time to fix it. You can ignore a phone call because tomorrow seems guaranteed. Then the years begin doing what they do. People disappear, some slowly, some without warning, and eventually even men who once seemed almost indestructible start talking differently about time. Tony has lived through that. He survived the accident that nearly ended his guitar playing before it properly began. He survived the chaos surrounding Black Sabbath. He survived cancer. He watched the band break apart, reform, break apart again, and somehow return for moments nobody thought would ever happen. Then came the loss of Ozzy. That changed the picture again. For all the arguments, distance, and complicated years between them, Ozzy was attached to Tony's story in a way almost nobody else could be. They came from the same world, Birmingham, working-class families, a city of factories and noise. Two young men who could not possibly have understood what they were about to create together. And then one of them was gone. There is no way to know exactly what that does to a man like Tony. He does not speak about grief like someone trying to perform grief. That may be why it lands harder. There are no grand speeches. He talks. Then sometimes he stops. You feel the space around the words. Brian understands that space, perhaps better than most. He knows what it is like to continue after losing the person whose presence had become inseparable from the identity of the band. Freddie Mercury died in 1991, but for Brian, Roger and John, there was never a clean dividing line where Queen ended and something else began. How could there be? The songs remained, the photographs remained, the audience remained, and every time Brian stepped onto a stage to play those songs again, the absence was still there too. That kind of grief is strange because the person is gone, but the world refuses to let them disappear. Their voice keeps playing. Their face keeps appearing. People keep asking questions. You are allowed to move forward, but you are never really allowed to leave the past behind. Tony knows something similar now. Maybe that is one reason Brian fits beside him in a way another guitarist might not. There are things you do not have to explain to someone who has survived the same kind of silence. And by 2026, both men had accumulated plenty of silence. Brian had faced his own frightening health problems. There was the heart attack in 2020. Then, in 2024, the stroke. Brian later explained that he temporarily lost some control in his left arm. For anyone, that would be frightening. For a guitarist whose entire life has been built around the relationship between his hands and an instrument, it must have carried another layer entirely. Just imagine that moment. The hand that played Bohemian Rhapsody. The hand that played We Will Rock You. The hand that had spent decades moving instinctively across the neck of the Red Special. And suddenly, uncertainty. Would it work the same way? Would it come back? Those questions do not need to be spoken aloud to feel terrifying. Brian recovered enough to play again. Tony understood what that meant too. His own hands have always carried the memory of what nearly happened to him as a teenager. Those damaged fingertips shaped his technique and indirectly helped shape the sound of heavy metal itself. Two guitarists, two very different injuries, two men whose hands became part of their mythology. And now they are still playing. That alone gives the collaboration a different feeling, but there is something else. Brian's gift to Tony, the left-handed Red Special. It took roughly 2 years to make, designed specifically for Tony. Not a random guitar with a signature on it, a carefully built instrument that connected Brian's most personal object, the guitar he and his father originally created, with Tony's own playing style and needs. Think about the intimacy of that. Guitarists can be strangely sentimental about instruments. They remember where they bought them, who gave them one, what room they were in when they found a certain sound. Some guitars become almost like family photographs you can play. So when Brian gave Tony a version of the Red Special, built for his hands, it was not simply a luxury present between wealthy rock stars. There was history inside it. Brian's father, Tony's damaged fingers, Queen, Sabbath, decades of friendship, all contained in this strange wooden object with strings. You could probably write an entire story about that guitar alone. But Tony did something more meaningful than displaying it. He kept the relationship alive. And then, when From the Dark was taking shape, Brian entered Tony's musical world once again, not for nostalgia, not to recreate 1989. Not because some record executive had decided that putting the words Brian May in the promotional material would generate headlines. He came because Tony wanted him there. There is an old recording of two famous musicians sharing a stage or studio, and sometimes you can feel them trying to impress each other. This does not feel like that. Tony and Brian are too far beyond it. What would Tony possibly prove to Brian May now? What would Brian prove to Tony Iommi? That he can play guitar? They settled that question around 50 years ago. Maybe that is why Brian's decision not to play more on the album becomes so revealing. Tony offered. Brian declined. He thought Tony's solos were already right. That is such a small moment that it would be easy to overlook. But imagine the alternative. Brian could have taken another song, then another. The record could easily have become a story about two legendary guitarists trading solos. Fans would have loved that. Music magazines would have had their headline, Tony versus Brian, Sabbath meets Queen. Who played the better solo? That endless machinery of comparison could begin again. Brian apparently had no interest in it. He played where Tony wanted him. Then he left space. And perhaps this is the real secret, underneath Tony's choice. Brian knew how to be present without needing to become the center of the room. That quality is rare. Not just among rock stars, among people. There are friends who enter your life and immediately make everything about themselves. Then there are the ones who somehow know when to speak, when to listen, when to sit there without fixing anything. When you are 25, maybe that does not seem terribly important. When you have lived through illness, funerals, broken bands, lost friends, and enough years to understand that time is running faster than it once did, it becomes very important. Tony and Brian are often described through enormous words: pioneers, legends, icons, guitar heroes. Those words are true, I suppose, but they also create distance. They turn human beings into statues. And the older Tony gets, the more interesting the ordinary details become. Brian visiting the house, a guitar sitting nearby. They start playing. Tony remembering Brian's tone. Brian making a guitar for his friend. Tony asking him to play on a song. Brian showing up. No stadium, no fireworks, just continuity. There is something almost reassuring about that, because rock history is full of friendships that ended badly. John Lennon and Paul McCartney spent years apart before Lennon's death. Roger Waters and David Gilmour became symbols of a band divided against itself. Even inside Black Sabbath, relationships were rarely simple. Success puts pressure on people. Money does too. So does age, so does memory. You remember the same night differently. One person remembers a joke, another remembers an insult. And 50 years is an awfully long time to remain in someone's life. Tony and Brian managed it. Not perfectly, perhaps. Nobody knows every private moment between two people. But they remained close enough that when Tony had something new to say musically, Brian was still someone he wanted beside him. That may be the most important fact. Not that Brian May is famous. Not that Brian May is one of the most recognizable guitarists alive. Not even that Tony admires his sound. It is that Brian was still there. At this age, and still there becomes one of the most meaningful phrases in any friendship. Still there after the tours, still there after Freddie, still there after Ozzy, still there after Tony's cancer, still there after Brian's heart problems and stroke, still there when so many people from the early days are not. And perhaps that changes how we should hear Death Wake. Not as some grand symbolic farewell. Tony has not described it that way, and there is no reason to force meaning where he did not put it. But you cannot entirely remove the lives of the people playing from the sound they make. They bring everything with them. The factories of Birmingham, the homemade fingertips, the red special built with Brian's father, Freddie's empty place, Ozzy's empty place, hospitals, comebacks. The strange reality of being an old man and still being recognized as the young man on an album cover from 50 years ago. All of it comes into the room. Then somebody counts in, and they play. Maybe that is why Tony did not need a list of names. There are probably hundreds of guitarists who would have loved to appear on the record, many younger, many technically astonishing, many deeply influenced by Iommi. But influence is not the same as history. Admiration is not the same as trust. And skill is not the same as knowing someone. Tony already had someone who understood the language. Brian. It sounds almost too simple when you reduce it to one name. But perhaps that is what happens after enough years pass. The reasons become simpler, not more complicated. You stop asking who is the biggest star. You ask who you want in the room. Who knows when something is right? Who can hear the music without trying to change its identity? Who remembers you before the mythology became so enormous? Who can look at Tony Iommi and still see Tony, not the father of heavy metal, not the man in the photographs, just the friend he met decades ago? And Brian presumably gets the same in return. Someone who knew him when Queen was still becoming Queen. Someone who heard that strange guitar sound early and understood there was something different about it. Someone who was around before every ordinary interaction between them could become two legends reunite. Maybe that is the privilege of very old friendship. You remember each other before the world decided who you were supposed to be, and now Tony has another album. Brian has another solo on a Tony Iommi song. Fans will analyze the notes, the tone, the equipment. They will probably debate where it ranks among their collaborations. That is what fans do. But I suspect the more interesting part happened before a note was played. The decision. Tony knowing who to call, Brian saying yes, and then Brian knowing when enough was enough. There may not be some dramatic secret behind why it had to be Brian May. Perhaps Tony has already given us the answer in the most ordinary way possible. He trusted him. After all these years, through everything that happened to both of them, he still trusted him. And when so much of the world they once knew has disappeared, that may be worth more than another guitar solo. The album will come out. People will listen. Time will move again. Maybe they will record together another time. Maybe they won't. Neither man can really promise that anymore. That is the uncomfortable part. At their age, every collaboration has the possibility of becoming the last without anyone knowing it while it is happening. So perhaps the thing to notice is not whether Tony and Brian create some grand final statement together. It is simply that, in 2026, they are still here, still friends, still reaching for guitars, still able to surprise each other, and somewhere between Tony's heavy, unmistakable sound and Brian's strange singing guitar, that friendship keeps leaving little pieces of itself behind. Maybe that is all Tony ever needed from Brian. Or maybe, after 50 years, there are reasons even they would struggle to put into words.